Okay, I think I'm live. Let's check my volumes here in my live streaming software. Adjust the screen a little bit. And welcome back to the Great Philosophers at Fanshawe College, PHIL-1006 in the summer of 2020. This is week slash, it should really be called Module 13. Let me just edit that live right here. And this is actually going to be our last live stream because that's the content for this course. So we're really wrapping things up now. I just want to draw your attention to a couple things over in the class, which is that your last short online quiz, I think most of you wrote it, but I extended the deadline just an extra couple of days. For those of you who didn't get around to online quiz number 4, please finish it. The next thing you're going to do is the final exam. So it's available now, and it'll stay available for a little while. I think I'm going to extend that to Sunday as well. And of course your final papers. I know that's a lot. It's an accelerated course. We are doing a lot of work in a very short amount of time, but thanks for staying with the class. I hope you found it at least informative, not too boring. I prefer being in the classroom environment to this live stream business, but those of you who have been watching the videos, thanks for watching. And thanks for sending me those emails, and really I hope that the rest of the summer goes really well for you folks. This week we are talking about John Rawls and some of his critics. The reason I'm talking about John Rawls is because I think he's a pretty pivotal political philosopher that kind of captures the spirit of philosophy as it's practiced in analytic North American philosophy departments. Especially in the fields of political philosophy and normative ethics. I talked a little bit in the analytic philosophy module about, Wittgenstein and Kripke and the kind of more metaphysically oriented, logically oriented thinkers. But let's talk about contemporary political philosophy because I think it's timely and it's a really interesting, to me, an interesting argument that Rawls presents. What is it an argument about? Well, look, in the pre-war period, I'm going to call it 1850, 1950, but really the end of World War II kind of marks the end of a specific period of intellectual history. Prior to the end of the Second World War, political philosophy was really centrally concerned with really kind of foundational questions about the possibility of political revolution, the ethical nature of revolution, about the very nature of political legitimacy and of the state. And you had clashes between fundamentally different ideologies and answers as to how the modern nation state should be organized at a very basic level. You had clashes between Marxist ideology, liberal ideology, and I don't mean liberalism in the sense that the Americans say, like, oh, you're a liberal, I'm a conservative. I mean political liberalism in the kind of sense of classical liberalism, which is democratic institutions, freedom of the press, the kind of things we take for granted in liberal democracies. You had, of course, non-democratic views at the time, running from authoritarianism all the way to fascism and totalitarianism, which were, of course, very radically different proposals for how you're going to organize and structure the nation state. But the post-war period really changed this landscape, especially in 1990, 1991, with the final collapse of the Soviet Union. It seemed to me that it seemed to many people that the model of liberal democracy supported by a market economy, or at least a mixed model, largely market economy, had ultimately triumphed. And a lot of authors in this period basically said there was no alternative to a liberal democratic society, including Francis Fukuyama, who wrote, do I have a slide about this? I don't think I do. But Francis Fukuyama wrote a book, an essay turned into a book called The End of History, which basically argued there were no other political models left apart from liberal, democratic, capitalist societies. So this is really kind of a radical change from the pre-war period where you had lots of different ideologies on the table. So what should a liberal democracy look like, given that it's a given, right? Given that we're going to be stuck with it in the post-war period. Um, well, in the North American kind of sphere, especially, we have the Great Depression of 1929 to 1939, where he left a really important mark, um, in the sense that it kind of opened a political window to the possibility of much greater state intervention into the economy, suggesting like the welfare state model. Right? Many people, most notably economist John Maynard Keynes, right, Keynesian economics, argue that government has actually responsibility to act during periods of economic crisis. Part of the idea here, the Keynesian model is not to always spend, but to spend what they call counter-cyclically. So you want to be a counterweight. So a Keynesian economist says, paradoxically, here's what you should do. You should run deficits during economic downturns. This is exactly when you should run a deficit. But however, you have to have the discipline, Keynes says, that when the economy starts turning back around and things are well, that's when you're going to start cutting back and hopefully run a surplus and balance. Well, I mean, he doesn't say you should balance the budget. That is not a Keynesian view, but you should keep the debt as a certain percentage of the GDP. Sorry, I don't mean to get into the weeds about the economics of John Maynard Keynes, but it's a very influential view that government has a duty to intervene in the economy. So this idea of the welfare state, really, which we're talking about the period from 1920 to 1940, when a lot of its kind of basic framework was set up, provides services to citizens like healthcare. We'll also set regulations on the economy, such as minimum wage and what sort of contracts are acceptable. If you've ever read John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, for example, you'll see practices like paying people in company scrip, which is basically money that is only redeemable with the person employing you, which is a great way to create a population that is utterly dependent and unable to move on as a workforce, because you're always going to stay in debt. Company scrip, right? So you're not paid cash, you're paid in money only redeemable at the company store. These practices were outlawed during this period. So the Keynesian approach is really in contrast to a more laissez-faire approach. Laissez-faire, which kind of means like let it happen, let it, don't touch anything, which argues that the free market is always going to be a more efficient solution to economic problems than state intervention. So the policies of the New Deal, right, the welfare state that came out of the Great Depression, required not just a political justification, but also like a philosophical and moral justification. Am I still live here? Yeah, the stream looks like it's healthy. Okay, just double check. Once I was streaming, I ended up talking to nothing for like half an hour. So you can argue economically, right? So Keynes said that actually occasionally government intervention is just going to be more efficient because there are market failures. Sometimes the market fails. This could be because of a lack of information. It could be because of cartel forms. It could be because of manipulation. There's all kinds of reasons a market can fail. And sometimes you need to intervene to make up for these failures, right, as evidenced by the Great Depression. A lot of people pushed back very hard on this idea of the welfare state. Hayek is probably the most well-known, at least in academic circles, because I think he himself has the academic credentials and the real arguments, as opposed to some of the other, I don't mean to get too political in this one, but like someone like Ayn Rand, for example, isn't taken very seriously in academia, but Hayek is. So his popular text is called A Road to Serfdom, and he says that any kind of central planning, even like a welfare state, like a Keynesian New Deal, is ultimately empowering the state over the individual. And this would lead to tyranny, because if you don't have freedom in your economic affairs, you can't have personal and political freedom. This is a view that if Hayek, I think, and there's a link here you can kind of look at here, kind of paradoxically led Hayek to support dictatorships that promised certain kinds of economic reform and resisted socialization of aspects of the economy because he believed economic freedom was a more fundamental right. So if you had a dictatorship that would, throw political dissidents in jail or close newspapers, but promised market reform, Hayek would be like, oh yeah, well, the economic freedom is more important. which is certainly a view you can have. Um, so we're talking about the Great Depression and the New Deal, and how do we justify government intervention in the economy? Isn't it a violation of economic freedom? So this is a little abstract, so let me give you a concrete example. Take a program like universal healthcare, right? Fanshawe College is in Canada. Canada has it's within the province's jurisdiction, of course, but there's universal health care, right? If I have my OHIP card, I go to the hospital and I get treated. It's free, but I mean, of course, I pay taxes. So it's free, but what really is it's funded by a taxpayer model. And universal health care actually exists in pretty much every developed country in the first world in some form. I mean, for example, Germany has like a partial system. Japan has a very full system. You can kind of look at how they set it up. There's lots of different models. But the holdout is the United States. And if you kind of look into some of the arguments that the states have had over this issue, right, which kind of came to the fore during the Obama years because a lot of people were pushing for a universal system, often you might find that this is not purely a question of economics. It's not fully a question of like, oh, markets are more efficient. Sometimes it's also a question of morality, which is within the purview of political philosophy. Here's one recent editorial from Forbes arguing against universal health care. Socialized systems which attempt to guarantee a supposed right to health care can only do so by violating the actual rights of those obliged to pay for it. If one person has a right to something he did not earn, of necessity it requires that another person not have a right to something he did earn. So the idea is that if I'm taxed and paying for a universal system, I'm paying for your broken leg. Why am I paying for your broken leg? I earned my money, right? Your right to health care is really a right of expropriation of my assets. That's right. And I think this moral view is becoming more and more prominent now. This argument is increasingly waged on a moral ground since the data kind of does support the view that universal programs and healthcare are often more efficient than private insurance regimes. Right, so the philosophical argument here that I want to discuss, and I'm going to get to Rawls in a sec, is that an individual's right to their earnings should not be violated in the name of someone else's right to health care. Right? The right to keep your earnings is more fundamental than someone else's right to health care. That's the moral argument here. And just to support the view that it has to be a moral argument, not an economic one, right? Healthcare cost per capita in the United States way higher as a percent of GDP with much worse outcomes. Right? The healthcare outcomes in the United States are across the board pretty bad. You want to just take a statistic like infant mortality rate, which is a statistic that we use to track, which is kind of a really nice barometer of how healthy and well-served a population is. The United States' infant mortality rate is high, is very high. It's higher than Cuba's and many third world countries. So it seems that their private insurance system is actually inefficiently allocating resources compared to a lot of places with better outcomes and less costs as a percentage of GDP. So it's a moral argument. So how do we resolve a moral argument, right? That an individual's right to their earnings should not be violated in the name of someone else's right to health care. So, I mean, you might think, oh, well, that's easy. If we live in a democracy, all we need to do is have a vote. And if a majority of people vote in favor of the program, that's it. But should the dissenting minority be forced to pay taxes into the system? Well, this kind of really depends on our conception of the limits of individual rights. Right? We all agree some rights can't be violated by the majority, so a majority doesn't always rule. We might think majority rules for something like healthcare, but we don't think majority rule can be a justification for mass discrimination. Suppose like 80% of Canadians wanted to discriminate against redheads, people with red hair, right? Say, you know what, people with gingers, people with red hair shouldn't be allowed to vote. They shouldn't be allowed to open a business, right? Let's just discriminate against them. Well, the charter would not allow it, even if the majority wanted to, right? Charter rights are kind of a bulwark, a fortification against the tyranny of the majority. So we all agree, right? There's limits on what a majority can do. But is taxation towards universal health care a similar situation? Do we have a right to our earnings that cannot be violated ever by the majority? What does this even mean? In other words, is paying taxes towards the welfare state a violation of individual rights, the way discrimination against people on the basis of ethnicity or national origin or religion is a violation of individual rights? That's the question. And Rawls is going to try and answer this question, because it's really complex. What rights do we have? Obviously, a person who is against universal health care believes that the right to their earnings trumps your right to your health care. So what's the extent of rights? What rights cannot be violated by the majority? What do we do when rights seem to conflict? In a democracy, we wish to be legally and politically equal, but also free. Can we do both? When it comes to taxation, we can certainly argue that our earnings, and I'm putting it in scare quotes because our earning potential is not just a factor of ourselves, but it's a factor of the society we live in. On the grounds that, right, these earnings aren't just solely a function of your abilities. They depend on the existence of public infrastructure. They depend on the idea that there are courts that can litigate and resolve contractual disputes, that there are roads, that there's a well-educated populace, that there's a healthy populace, right? Without these things, without this public infrastructure, our ability to make money would be severely impaired. So it's a fair trade-off. I mean, okay, this is a nice argument. But could a more general argument be given that would really morally justify taxation and redistribution, other than our earning power depends on public infrastructure? And Rawls is going to say yes. There's a way to rethink the social contract in the age of the liberal democratic welfare state. How am I doing for time here? 20 minutes. I feel like I've been pretty efficient. So, John Rawls, who was born in 1921, died in 2002, argued in A Theory of Justice, and later on, Justice as Fairness, kind of a restatement of his theories. This is a really good book, by the way, so you're interested in political philosophy, modern political philosophy, and not just like pop culture political philosophy, which everyone should avoid, but like actual academic work. This is a great one right here. So he argued for a new form of the social contract, saying, ultimately, we need to found the modern state on an ideal of fairness, and this will help resolve our competing moral demands between equality and freedom, because these are in conflict with each other. Perfect equality obviously violates individual freedom. However, perfect individual freedom also could extend into a form of tyranny because of an unequal access to power. And A Theory of Justice is probably one of the most influential defenses of the modern welfare state. He says the welfare state is actually a just state. It can be morally defended. So Rawls will say justice is fairness. Justice is fairness, which is a meaningful liberty that can be exercised by all. How do we defend this idea? So Rawls basically proposes, and again, I'm going to kind of boulderize some stuff to keep it under an hour, that we should think about justice, and this is going to be very similar to these kind of state of nature style social contract theories. But he's going to call it the original position. So we should think about justice from the point of view of the original position. And there's a link here. If you click on it, it'll take you to the Wikipedia article for this concept. He says, look, we should not reflect on justice based on who we are already, on what we do, on what we know. Really, we need to articulate universal principles, something everyone can agree with. And the original position is going to be a position in which we select principles to guide society without knowledge of our position in society. We're going to deliberate about justice, and we should pretend that we are behind a veil of ignorance, that we don't know who we are. We don't know if we're rich or if we're poor. We don't know anything about ourselves. So we should just pretend just play a game of make-believe. I don't know who I am. I could be any random member of my society. And when I exit the original position, when I remove the veil of ignorance, I could just find myself to be anyone. I'm like, oh gosh, it turns out I'm a, I'm a different person than I thought I'd be. Right? I didn't realize, oh my gosh, turns out I'm a woman, I'm a white man, I'm a black man. And then the decisions I made behind the veil of ignorance, since I don't know what kind of person I'll be, could affect me. Right? So the idea of this thought experiment, it's a way of thinking about justice. Act as if, reason as if you didn't know anything about yourself, your race, your religion, ethnicity, gender, your class, your education, and so on, your health. Are you, abled, disabled? Were you born rich? Were you born poor? Are you religious? Are you an atheist? You can't know any of these things. You pretend you don't know these things. And how would you arrange society if you don't know? Well, if no one knows his place in society, his class position, social status, his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, intelligence, strength, I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conception of the good or their special psychological propensities. You don't even know what kind of person you are psychologically. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. And this is useful, Rawls will argue, because here you're going to get a fair and impartial basis. Right? You don't know if you're going to be strong or weak, rich or poor, intelligent, average, religious, secular, gender, ethnicity. And you can't be unfair if you reason this way. For example, how does this work in practice? If I don't know whether I'm religious or not, I must rationally choose a fair society with freedom of religion. That's how I know freedom of religion is fair. Because if I don't know if I'm religious or not, the only fair decision is to have freedom of and freedom from religion. Freedom to practice and freedom to refrain from practice. Right? So we know there's a diversity of religious views. We know that some people just aren't particularly religious. So I'm reasoning behind the veil of ignorance, and I'm supposed to go like, all right, I don't know if I'm religious or not. What kind of laws about religion should I have? Should I ban religion? Well, no, because what if it turns out I'm Catholic? All right. Should I ban atheism? Well, no, what if I'm an atheist? All right, I guess we'll have to have freedom of religion, because that's the only fair decision. And I can come to this conclusion because I'm reasoning as if I didn't know whether or not I have religious beliefs. Likewise for all these other things, right, that we suddenly don't know about ourselves. Right? I can't rationally choose an apartheid or racist society if I don't know what race I am. A racist state is not fair. It's not universal from the original position. I can't go thinking like, you know what, I really think we should be discriminating against, redheads. Well, what if you are a redhead? Shoot, good point. I don't know. Because you're not supposed to know. So as you're deliberating behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, you're coming up with a society that must be fair because you don't even know if you're going to be rich or poor. All right, which comes back to the question of the welfare state. What kind of economy do we want behind the veil of ignorance, right? I don't know if I'm rich or poor. Not only do I don't know whether I'm rich or poor, I don't know if I'm particularly talented at anything. What if I'm just an average person? What if I'm slightly below average? What if I'm slightly above average? Since you can't know these things, you don't know if you're talented or a normal person, you'd probably want some kind of balance between protecting the poor from like extreme poverty and destitution, but also allowing the rich to succeed to a level, right? Because you might reason like this. Well, okay, suppose I turn out to be poor because I'm born to really poor parents, right? Well, I clearly want a society where I don't starve to death. You can be poor for all kinds of reasons, right? You could just be, right, sociologically speaking, the best determinant of your class status is your parents' class status, right? Class mobility, especially in the United States, is actually pretty low. But you could also just have problems functioning in the modern economy through no fault of your own. Maybe something happened to you or sick when you were a kid and you're slightly disabled. Maybe you want to be in a profession which doesn't make a lot of money. Well, you want a society where things like that don't mean you starve to death, where you might have access to medical care, in case disaster strikes, again, through no fault of your own. Educational opportunities, right? You want some social mobility. You want a safety net in case of disaster, right? And if you want these things, you want a society with just enough taxation and redistribution to allow this, but not too much, because it's also possible that I'm rich. And it's also possible that I'm very talented. It's also possible that I could end up being a millionaire. And I don't want to be taxed so that everyone's equal. So I need to moderate redistribution in case I'm poor. So in such a way that whatever this hypothetical society ends up looking like, I can still enjoy wealth should I be wealthy. So inequality is okay within limits. And this limit is not a limit that we're going to be able to argue for in terms of a fundamental capital R right, where we say, here's the cutoff line, it is moral to have this amount of money. It's going to be a juggling act as we try to find a balance between allowing inequality to occur as a result of natural distribution of talents and effort and sweat and grit, which is all good, but also wanting to create a safety net, a floor below which people don't sink because disaster can strike, or because you just might be an ordinary person, and we should not expect ordinary people to do extraordinary things just to live a life with dignity. So this balancing act that we do in the original position economically justifies some redistribution, justifies at the same time some inequality. But instead of massive amounts of inequality, you create a ceiling and a floor, and you just kind of squish variation to within a certain amount which we find acceptable. So we don't want people to starve to death, but we also want people to be able to, work hard and succeed. And that's how this equilibrium is achieved, by reflection through the original position. This doesn't mean we're unable to justify a framework of basic human rights. Of course we are, right? You want to have a fair and just economy that tolerates inequality to a certain extent while giving meaningful opportunities to all. But in terms of human rights, clearly if you don't know your own opinions, you want freedom of speech. If you don't know whether you're a man or a woman, or one of my NB friends, you don't want society to systematically discriminate against half the population. It doesn't make sense. Like you're flipping a coin and you're like, oops, turns out I'm discriminated against. That's not rational. Therefore, it's not fair. So we do have a framework of rights that flow from reasoning behind the veil of ignorance in the original position. So Rawls is going to claim, so I've had a bunch of examples about voting rights and the economy and redistribution, but really at the abstract level what Rawls is saying is that rational people deliberating under the veil would come to similar conclusions. As if you don't know anything about your opinions, your religion, your ethnicity, your gender, right, your abilities, your talents, you're going to want roughly the following things. The most extensive liberty compatible with the same liberty for others, right? Because you could be the other. Inequalities minimized such that the worst off are not harmed. So in case you're the worst off, you're like, oh, you wake up and you're like, I'm out of the veil of ignorance. Oh gosh, I'm homeless. Guess I freeze to death tonight. That sucks. You don't want that. And if you don't want it for you, you don't want it for anyone. And fair equality of opportunity for positions and offices. And this are the basic tenets of modern welfare state liberalism, which is just an attempt to mediate the demands of equality with liberty. And this is how we're going to get there, Rawls says. Now, Rawls is an interesting political philosopher. He's going to make a distinction here between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. What does this mean? Look, ideal theory says we're all going to agree on some principles and agree to follow them through this idealized model of deliberation. And it's basically the thought experiment I've been walking us through. What kind of society would you think is fair if you didn't know anything about who you were? And then you come up like, well, I want a society with like equal rights because discrimination is obviously irrational if I don't know what group I belong to. I'm going to want an economy with, you know, where inequality is sort of managed, right? Because I don't know who I am. But this is an idealized theory. But it'll help us with non-ideal theory, how to change existing society to approximate this ideal. The world is imperfect. And there'll be conflicts between our ideal theory and our non-ideal implementation. And Rawls is going to say there's a process he's called reflective equilibrium. It's going to be sometimes hard to implement our ideals, and what we should do is just our best to maximize consistency between our ideal beliefs, balancing competing demands, knowing that the ideal is something just to strive for, even if it can never be perfectly reached. And so reflective equilibrium acknowledges that there might be competing demands as we attempt to let our ideal theory guide us in our actual practical implementation. So the reason I'm talking about this is because a lot of political philosophy is kind of based on an idea of foundationalism. That there are certain core foundational principles that cannot ever be modified or challenged, right? They have to hold. There are core values that cannot be violated. They're absolute. Again, I'm bringing up Ayn Rand again. I'm not a big fan of Ayn Rand, and I never teach her work. But Ayn Rand is a good example of a foundationalist, right, who holds a very strong line on individual rights such that they cannot be violated. But reflective equilibrium under Rawls denies foundationalism. Because we're trying to seek consistency as best we can in non-ideal theory, we must sometimes tinker with the ideal theory. And let me give you an example here, right? We generally speaking want to assert the ownership rights of private patents. Generally speaking, we do. Right? It's okay to own patents, to own things. However, if we imagine that there's a life-saving medicine, suppose there's a cure for COVID-19, there's a cure for the coronavirus, it could be cheaply mass-produced. However, some Martin Shkreli type, some kind of pharmaceutical exec owns the idea and is saying, you're going to have to pay me trillions of dollars for it. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of people are dying. Well, reflective equilibrium will ask us to kind of tinker with this idea of individual ownership rights. And we might say, actually, we're going to prioritize the lives of the many over the patent rights of the few if it's too unaffordable and people are dying. And that's just part of the reflective equilibrium here. You can't be an absolutist or foundationalist about these things. You have to, and reasoning through the veil of ignorance is actually one of the ways in which we reach the reflective equilibrium between competing demands. The demands of people dying, the demands of some person's private hold over medicine. And we do this all the time already. Right? Everyone agrees. Every reasonable person agrees that even though free speech is a really core value, that's super important, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Free speech is weighed against the right to personal safety. Right? So if I get up in a crowded theater and I yell, there's a fire, everybody out, and it causes a huge rush and a tumult and chaos and people are trampling each other and 20 people die, my right to free speech doesn't justify or make it okay to yell fire. Look, this is free speech, man. Well, yeah, but 20 people died. So you kind of weigh these things. Right? And yelling fire in a crowded theater, actually, there's a Wikipedia page for this one, right, is kind of one of the core principles of how the law interprets the right of freedom of speech. Right? So that's kind of Rawls. And again, the idea, just to kind of sum it up, is that the kind of society that we would want is the kind of society that we would find fair if we didn't know anything about ourselves. and we had to kind of re-enter this society we've created, and then we just find ourselves to be one of its members. Right? So you're reasoning about a society as if you didn't know anything about yourself. Your race, nationality, religion, gender, abilities, talents, how rich your parents are, how poor your parents are. And then when you re-enter this society, you find out all these attributes, and you're like, well, whew, sure dodged a bullet setting up a society that's fair for everyone. Because I turned out to be actually like the son of like poor Appalachian coal miners. Good thing I chose a society with free healthcare, extensive labor protections, and an education system that gives me opportunities no matter where I'm from. Right? Because these things all make sense. Is this PDF going to load? So I have a theory of justice here. Really modern classic if you want to read it. I'm going to close with a couple critiques of Rawls, just in the interests of fairness. Get it? Justice is fairness. So the two critiques are as follows. One of them is due to, let me just look at the time here, 40 minutes. Charles Mills. And Charles Mills is going to kind of argue that Rawls is too focused on ideal theory. Because the notion that you can reason to fairness abstracting from who you are and what people are, including their history, including their ethnicity, can really neglect crucial political facts, in particular as they are related to race, and particularly so in the United States. So there's kind of a, so you'll see, I'm going to get to it. The other critique is due to a libertarian called Robert Nozick saying, look, the original position can't possibly justify redistribution of wealth. All right, so let's start with Charles Mills' critique of Rawls. And again, the basic critique is that ignoring aspects of who you are during reasoning really neglects key aspects of politics. So Charles Mills actually really kind of raises an interesting point, is that Rawls was active was teaching and writing his book during a period in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s of tremendous upheaval in America over the civil rights movement. And he doesn't really talk about it as very much, which is a bizarre omission if you think about it, because here's a perfect case study of his system, right? That there had been people systematically excluded from the American social contract for hundreds of years, and they're asking to be let in. And Rawls is giving this kind of abstract exercise, but never really talking about the civil rights movement. Why is that? And we may legitimately worry, Mills says, that any account of justice will need to take into account some situated facts about race and gender. That you can't just abstract them away. Persistent patterns of injustice might survive attempts to deliberate behind the veil, because what we think of as objectivity behind the veil could be unjust. And in fact, this is often how arguments against civil rights legislation were given, right? So you might imagine that if you own a business, you have a right to refuse service as a business owner. And you could conceive this as a form of individual liberty in the abstract. But in practice, in the United States, this actually is a way of promoting systematic racial segregation. Right? If it just turns out that, well, yeah, the right of a business to refuse service is not just an individual thing, it's a systemic thing, because it turns out everyone gets together and says, you know what, we're not serving black people. Well, then that's not objectivity behind the veil. That's not individual liberty. That's systematic racial segregation. And refusal to consider issues like these is going to be a problem of ideal theory. Right? So universal principles that we think are good from the point of view of our reflective, ideal theory, veil of ignorance, original position, style, reasoning, right? Because we can't actually forget who we are. We might reason, well, it's their business. They can refuse service to whoever they want as individuals. I would want that right to just not serve people. Because in practice, this ideal is really highly discriminatory. And so here's people doing a lunch-in where you sit in at a lunch counter where only white people were allowed to eat in the 1950s. And people are pouring sodas on their heads, trying to get them out during this luncheon, during this protest for equal treatment. So if you argue from any kind of ideal original position, it will be really easy to miss various kinds of injustice. And it might not really be possible to put yourself in the original position. Your biases and worldviews will follow you behind the veil no matter how hard you try. So really the whole business of ideal theory, Charles Mills says, is not going to work. And this kind of colorblind ideal means that a Rawlsian theory of justice is never going to have to reckon with the moral issues raised by historical contemporary injustice. Right? For example, you're never going to have to ask yourself something like, look, suppose a segment of the population was just locked out of the social contract, locked out of opportunity for decades. What do you owe to this community? Right? So here's an example. It's called redlining. In the 1960s, sociologist John McKnight coined the term redlining to describe the practice of fencing off areas where banks would avoid investments based on community demographics. Right? The areas most frequently discriminated against were black inner-city neighborhoods. For example, in Atlanta in the 1980s, a Pulitzer Prize-winning series of articles by investigative reporter Bill Dedman showed that banks would often lend to lower-income whites but not to middle-income or upper-income blacks. So the idea is you're going to be locked out of access to financial services, right, by these maps, by these red-lined maps that say, yeah, these areas, don't give them mortgages. Well, why not? Well, we know why. Racism. So what Mills is saying, and he says, look, what's really happened is that alongside this kind of neutral ideal theory social contract, which really only meant to apply to certain people, alongside it was a different contract, the racial contract. And that racial contract deliberately excluded people. He says, if you want to understand politics in America, the notion of a racial contract might be more revealing of the real character of the world we're living in, the corresponding historical deficiencies of its normative theories and practices, than the raceless notions currently dominant in political theory. So often when I'm talking about things like redlining and historical injustice, there's a little bit of pushback in the sense of like, this is so long ago and it's over now. Or, why is this my problem? It's just everybody's problem. And look, suppose I chose 20% of my class because they, I don't know, on any basis, right? Suppose I don't like gamers. And suppose, hypothetically, I identify every video game player in the class and I make sure they get C's. From now on, if you play video games, the highest grade you can get is a C. C plus, maybe, if I'm feeling generous. That's discriminatory. And suppose I agree and I say, all right, I'll stop the practice. From now on, I'll try to grade more fair. Nobody would be satisfied with this because it's not enough to stop. The people who had been getting C's the whole semester would stop and ask that their work be regraded. They'd be like, you need to regrade my first paper. I'm like, that's in the past. Why are you trying to make me feel guilty? What happened in the past? Jeez. Right? We would all agree that historical injustice, it's not enough to stop it. It must be corrected. That's the thing ideal theory can miss. Especially because it's tempting to think that a problem like racism is a strictly interpersonal problem that can occur between any two individuals. It's just a kind of attitude. And really, it's a deplorable attitude that runs counter to, our political, legal, or social ideals, right? But fundamentally, it's a problem of individuals. That guy is a racist. But for theorists like Mills, and frankly, I agree, the problem clearly obviously runs deeper than interpersonal prejudice. What we call structural or systemic racism goes beyond individual attitudes. It's not just about a person being racist, acting unfairly. It describes institutions, it describes laws, practices, policies, whole economies that are just unequal, unjust, fundamentally racist. Right? I've already given the example of redlining, which is the practice of denying financial services to specific communities in the United States, typically black neighborhoods. Now, this is historically, and I shouldn't even say historically because it has been ongoing since the 1940s and exists today. However, home ownership, owning a home is actually the main way middle-class families build wealth and pass it down intergenerationally to their children. Now, the fact is, since the boom in individual home ownership in the United States, beginning again in the kind of post-war period, right? We're talking like 1940s, 1950s, black people in the United States were systematically denied access to these loans. And this during the longest peacetime economic expansion in American history. Right? And as the link a few slides ago mentioned, it wasn't about their economic status. It wasn't about, oh, well, you just don't qualify. It was about their racial status. And in fact, unequal access to financial services continues to this day. Right? This is another link you can look at here. It's about the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008. And again, how minority communities were systematically targeted for subprime loans, even if they qualified for better loans. Now, this has had really serious economic consequences over the past 70 years. Right? Because again, middle class wealth passes through home ownership. And if 50, 60, 70 years ago, your grandparents were not able to buy a home and build up that equity, they couldn't pass it down to your parents. And your parents couldn't pass it down to you and make it harder to go to college. Right? Make it harder to live in a neighborhood with good schools because, of course, the schools themselves are funded on the basis of property taxes. And if the property taxes are low, you're in a bad school district. If you're a bad school district, you'll have fewer opportunities. So the cycle of poverty perpetuates itself just because you're born in the wrong spot. That's not fairness. Right? And this, again, it's a system. Right? After the Second World War, you had something called the GI Bill. The GI Bill said, if you were a soldier serving in this war, right, we'll help you go to college, we'll help you buy a house, we'll help you collect unemployment until you find employment. But once again, there was no social contract, Mill says, there was a racial contract because black soldiers systematically excluded from the loans and the mortgage assistance that white soldiers got. And again, we have a problem of intergenerational wealth transfer, where again, during this huge economic expansion in the post-war period, that if you systematically exclude a generation of people from it, they're not going to reap the benefits of this economy that other people did. But it goes deeper than that, unfortunately. Some of you might have seen this documentary called 13th on Netflix. The 13th is the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution. It's the one that formally bans slavery. And sometimes you'll hear people say, well, slavery's been over for 150 years, get over it. This is a garbage argument. If you read the text of the 13th Amendment, it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So the exception is, right, of course, punishment for crime. So the 13th Amendment did not end slavery at all. What simply happened is that police, especially in the South, would pass laws like vagrancy laws or turn misdemeanors into felonies, and then through convict lease programs, note the wording here, you can lease a convict, just send people off to work in farms, send people off to work in coal mines, right? So 1908, almost 50 years after slavery formally ended, as the link here discusses, a man could still be arrested and sent to work in a coal mine in Alabama, worked basically to death and whipped, even though slavery's over. And this continued pretty much right up until World War II. The practice of sharecropping was commonplace through the Great Depression as well. You can look that up. Right? And many people have argued that the war on drugs, which has increased the prison population in the United States higher than any other country per capita, both in absolute terms and per capita. Right? The United States has, what, 4 or 5% of the world's population, but 22% of the world's prisoners. The most prisoners per capita in the world, disproportionately black. Why? It perpetuates a system of incarceration and forced labor, which goes all the way back to the 13th Amendment. If you want to read about this, I think one of the greatest books on the topic is called The New Jim Crow. And it kind of details how mass incarceration, which is something that has occurred really starting with the Nixon administration and the war on drugs, where you have this kind of exponential growth. And I really mean exponential literally. We're talking thousands of percents more people in the jail system, basically so they could be put to work. So they could be denied the right to vote. Right? So you can perpetuate the system of racial segregation that existed prior to the civil rights movement. And again, I have lots of links for you to look at here. All right, here's one. Is this going to load? So Baton Rouge, Louisiana, highest incarceration rate in the world, right? Within America, which has the highest. So the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. This is the state within America with the highest incarceration rate in the world, disproportionately black, right? A lot of it's the drug war, which has often harsher sentencing, even though black and white drug use is roughly the same on an individual per capita basis, but it's more aggressively enforced. You're more likely to get it upgraded to a felony, and if you're caught with drugs because of mandatory minimum sentencing and 3 strikes you're out rules, you're more likely to end up on a convict lend-lease program. So you can look at this link here, right? Samuel Singyangwi notes that, and he's a researcher on incarceration in the United States, says all the people serving food, cleaning, printing papers in the state legislature are prisoners, right? Here's some. Right, they also work, prisoners also work in the governor's mansion. This is what the governor's mansion looks like. Here's Angola State Penitentiary. And just notice the title of this article here. Which Louisiana prisoners get to work in the governor's mansion? Which ones get to work in the Capitol? Notice the language here, right? Which ones get to work in the nice place as opposed to in the fields? So what we have is definitely perpetuation under the cover of a neutral legal system, of the history and legacy of the Jim Crow era of discrimination in the South. So what we don't have here is neutral ideal justice. What we don't have here is a social contract. And, sorry, this is it's a little, makes me angry. And I've been following this for a very long time. You know, I remember I was 12 years old when the video of the Rodney King beating was released, causing several days of riots. And my parents, you know, remembered similar things happening in the 70s and 80s. And I just want things to change, I guess. And these reports come out, and they always say the same thing. So here's an investigation by the Department of Justice in 2014 following the shooting of Michael Brown. And it's an investigation of the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department, which concludes, this Department of Justice own investigation, Why does the police exist? Well, to generate revenue for the municipality is what it does. It's there not to serve and protect. It's there as a revenue generation mechanism for the municipality, and the people, the citizens living there, are the revenue sources, right? The department engaged in racial profiling as a matter of routine to meet their ticket quotas, right? And let me just quote the report to you. Ferguson's law enforcement practices are shaped by the city's focus on revenue rather than public safety needs, right? So they're interested in harassing you to get tickets. And in fact, later in the report, they even say that getting promoted and even keeping your job is a function of meeting your ticket quotas, meaning you got to go and harass people and find something to stop them for so you can meet your ticket quota and get revenue for the municipality, tie up people in the courts, and just extract that revenue from people, or else you're fired. Right? This emphasis on revenue has compromised the institutional character of the police department, contributing to a pattern of unconstitutional policing, has shaped the municipal court, leading to procedures that raise due process concerns and inflict unnecessary harm on members of the Ferguson community. Ferguson's police and municipal court practices reflect and exacerbate existing racial bias, including racial stereotypes. Ferguson's own data establish clear racial disparities that adversely impact African Americans. Right, so again, you don't have the social contract applying here. You have a different contract, Charles Mills would say. You have the racial contract in effect, where the police here don't exist to serve and help this community. At best, they're a kind of border guard serving to demarcate the two Americas that exist. So, I don't know. You can watch 13th on Netflix. PBS has a great documentary called Slavery by Another Name. These are kind of on the same topics here, where the provisions of the 13th Amendment that basically allowed slavery to continue under the cover of the criminal justice system really was used as a way to maintain the system of forced labor in the South, especially. Right, The New Jim Crow is a book that also talks a little bit about this, especially during the war on drugs phase. So this is kind of like the post-Civil War period, right, until the Second World War. This talks about the post-Civil Rights era, starting with the war on drugs around 70-71. Here's a documentary called Let the Fire Burn, which I think you should watch, about the bombing of the MOVE headquarters in Philadelphia by police. The MOVE organization, much like Black Lives Matters now, was just an organization of people agitating against police brutality and for equal rights. And it's called Let the Fire Burn because several city blocks burned down as a result of police actions here. Here are some pictures. Voter registration drive in Missouri, Mississippi in the early 1960s, which is people just having the right to vote but couldn't exercise it. If you're trying to register people to vote, you could lose your job. You could be beaten on the streets. You could be killed. Churches would be bombed that held clinics to help people register. Lots of people died. Here's a little boy in, I think, 1963 with an American flag and his No More Police Brutality sign. Here's the same sign of the same little boy. With a police officer in 1963. You know, things need to change. And the struggle is long, but you have to believe in the possibility of progress here. I think that's Charles Mills. So here's, if you're interested in Mills's work, there's kind of an introductory article from a magazine called The Nation online you can read, or you can just read his book, The Racial Contract, here. Obviously, this is a bit of a timely subject. If you're not sure what to think in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, I really enjoin you and ask you to read a little bit about the history of race relations in the United States, the history of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, to watch 13th, because I think to understand what's happening requires this 150-year historical perspective. Yeah, and it really kind of lays bare, I think, the limits, not just of Rawls, but of the society we've constructed here. Okay, deep breaths, let's move on. So Robert Nozick presents a very different sort of critique of Rawls. Just do a sharp 90-degree turn here. Nozick is going to argue that the redistributive policies of Rawls's just state just is going to violate rights of citizens. Can't be morally justified through the original position. The only justifiable role of the state is to protect the rights of citizens, not to engage in some kind of trade-off where violations are tolerated for the greater good. One way you can think of this conflict between Rawls and Nozick is kind of a utilitarianism versus deontology view. Mill versus Kant, J.S. Mill, not Charles Mills. All right, so Rawls is more of a utilitarian in the sense that deliberation under the veil can kind of focus on the greater good, whereas Nozick is more Kantian, more deontological. People are ends in themselves. Rights cannot be suspended for the greater good. So Nozick argues for a pretty minimal notion of the nation-state in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which is limited to the narrow functions of protection against force, theft, fraud, enforcement of contracts, and so on. Expansion past this is unjustified. So his argument roughly, okay, so the book is very long, but the kind of central argument, let me just summarize it this way. Suppose we set some kind of Rawlsian reflective equilibrium, veil of ignorance style limit on inequality, which results in some just wealth distribution. Right? Let's call this distribution 1, D1. This is how we want wealth to be. But then suppose 1 million people want to see LeBron James play basketball. They're willing to pay him $1 each, hypothetically. So LeBron James now is $1 million. And this new wealth distribution, distribution 2, is different from D1, which was created by Rawls-style reflection, but it cannot be unjust. So the fact that LeBron James now has $1 million can't be unjust because every individual agreed to the transaction. Every individual person gave LeBron James, like, hey, do you mind giving $1 to LeBron James to watch him play basketball? I'm like, yeah, that's great. Here's your $1. Now he has $1 million. So what happened here with LeBron James getting $1 million, Nozick says, can't be unjust. Right? Because every individual transaction was just, and therefore how could the total of it just become unjust? How can the total set of transactions have a property each individual transaction didn't have? That doesn't make sense. And this would apply to any share of wealth created by, again, individually just free transactions. So it's immoral to tax LeBron James on the basis of justice, because we all agreed to give him that money. Right? Inequality can't suddenly become unjust because of some kind of independent reasoning, as long as every individual transaction was just. Or, in other words, as Nozick says, no redistribution of wealth is compatible with liberty. James has a right to his wealth, since it was not acquired unjustly. All right, and Nozick extends this argument to taxation, which he considers theft. Now, what are some common responses to Nozick in the literature? Well, the flat-footed response by Rawls is just to say, I reject the idea of the Kantian-style absolute right to begin with. Rights are only justified from the original position. And so, you can't independently attack the original position with something that was only justified within it. Or we can take the Charles Mills route and say, look, from a point of view of ideal theory, it might be true that LeBron James justly acquired some wealth, and his justly acquired wealth should not be redistributed. But this is not true of historical wealth patterns. Historical wealth patterns are not the result of individually just transactions. They're actually a result of quite the opposite. So yeah, maybe in abstract, yes, but in practice, no. So, um, or again, redistribution could be justified on the basis that even LeBron James' ability to get $1 from everyone to play basketball is only possible because you have infrastructure, right? You have roads to drive to the stadium, you have education, so people can like afford the tickets and read and write and be able to like navigate the website, clean water, right? All these are state-funded enterprises. So there's at least a portion of your wealth is made possible by public goods. Now, consistent libertarians often say, well, yes, but wouldn't it be better if all roads were private and all water was private and all education was private? So at least they're consistent there. But the wouldn't it be better part of the argument is, of course, something that can be argued about. All right, so just to summarize very quickly, Rawls defends the idea of the welfare state by saying we should think of justice as something resulting from idealization in the original position. We should imagine we don't know anything about ourselves, our history, our race, our gender, or religious beliefs, and that will result in a just society. Charles Mills responds and says, maybe, but this is too idealized. There are historical patterns of injustice that are heavily racialized, and the more we have kind of an abstract pie-in-the-sky approach to theory, the less we're dealing with the stuff that's actually happening on the streets right now, which is not just historical, but continued racialized patterns of injustice, which we must address, which is, I think, a really fair criticism because Black lives matter a lot. Nozick turns around and says, actually, from a libertarian point of view, you actually can't defend redistribution at all because individual just transactions, even if they lead to a collective outcome, are still just, because where did the injustice come in from? Right, so that's Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And that's the class. I know it's a little bit of a longer one today. There was a lot to talk about. Thanks for watching. And as always, if you're not live, the stream will be available on YouTube. All right, good luck on your exams. Thanks for listening.